Again, Mr. President, I'd like to thank you very much, and we'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh, that's an interesting one.
Washington once again becomes the crossroads of war and peace. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has landed in the American capital, flanked this time by leaders of Europe's biggest powers. Their message is one of unity. Their goal is to prevent another humiliation like the one that unfolded in February when Donald Trump openly undermined Ukraine's cause inside the Oval Office. But this meeting is different. Trump has shifted course after his Alaska meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. No longer speaking of a ceasefire, but of a permanent settlement that would see Moscow take the Donbas region in full. And behind closed doors of the high-stakes diplomacy lies an even darker question. Was this war avoidable? Did Ukraine bring catastrophe upon itself by promising NATO when NATO itself never promised membership to Ukraine? So as Trump, Zelensky and Europe gather in Washington, the real issue is not just whether peace is possible, but whether Ukraine's leadership itself shares responsibility for the war. Hello and welcome. You're watching Statecraft with me, Geeta Mohan. The immediate stakes are clear. Zelensky and his allies face an American president who has shifted position dramatically. After meeting Vladimir Putin in Alaska, Donald Trump has relayed the Kremlin's bottom line for peace: full control of the Donbas region, Ukraine's industrial heartland. Donetsk and Luhansk, long contested, long fought over, are now being openly demanded as Russia's price for ending the war. Trump, once a loud advocate of a ceasefire, is now speaking of permanent settlements. And in private, according to officials, he has pressed Zelensky to consider Putin's terms. Zelensky has refused. But the fact that Trump now echoes Moscow's red lines is a signal, one that cannot be ignored in Kyiv. Yet as Europe rallies behind Zelensky, another reality is quietly intruding. Russia has never been ambiguous. For decades, Moscow has insisted that NATO expansion into Ukraine was unacceptable. Russian leaders from Boris Yeltsin to Vladimir Putin have delivered the same message. Ukraine inside NATO would be a red line. It was not hidden, not subtle, not whispered. It was said plainly, repeatedly, and forcefully. Russia's position was plain and clear. They did not want adversaries in their backyard, threatening them day in and day out. Similar to what America said in 1960s, when the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a major confrontation that brought United States of America and then Soviet Union close to war when Soviet Union had placed medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles in Cuba. The reason? Very similar to what is now for Russia. It is that they did not want adversaries and threats in their backyard. So the red line for Russia was no entry for Ukraine in the NATO. In 2022, when war erupted, Russia claimed it was acting on that very red line. Whether or not the West dismissed it, the fact remains Moscow's position was consistent, which leads to the debate now unfolding. Did Ukraine ignore the warnings, promising NATO membership to its people without NATO ever formally offering it? Inside Ukraine, that question is beginning to pierce the political conversation. In the midst of exhaustion and loss, some voices are now asking whether Zelensky overplayed his hand. NATO had never given Ukraine a guaranteed path to membership. Leaders in Washington, Berlin, and Paris were careful with their language, offering aspirations, partnerships, and eventual goals. But no Article 5 guarantee, no timetable, no treaty. And yet, Zelensky made NATO membership a cornerstone of his presidency. To his people, he promised that Ukraine's future was inside the alliance. To Russia, it was the ultimate provocation. The war that followed is now being seen by some Ukrainians not simply as Moscow's aggression, but as Kyiv's miscalculation.
Але від Сполучених Штатів ми сьогодні такої підтримки не чуємо. Знаємо, що вони і ще кілька європейських партнерів не підтримують наше членство в НАТО. Я вважаю, що це велике бажання Росії, воно співпадає з цим результатом.
Mr. President, the Europeans want Ukraine to be part of NATO as part of this deal. Are you willing to budge on that at all, or is it a firm?
Well, I could be very nice and say, oh, well, we'll work to it. Look, it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. That's what started this whole thing. And Biden said that, and all of a sudden the gun started. That was one of the primary reasons it started. And this was long before President Putin. They never said it was an impossibility.
Ukrainians are now questioning whether Zelensky promised too much to his people without the backing of his supposed allies. They point out that NATO leaders repeatedly stopped short of firm commitments. They reference the 2008 Bucharest summit, where NATO declared Ukraine would become a member someday, but gave no timeline and no plan. They recall the years of hedging by Germany and France, who feared provoking Moscow. Now, coming back to the meeting, for Europe, the concern is not only about territory or membership of NATO, it is about trust and whether Washington under Trump can still be relied upon as a partner. To understand the unease surrounding this Washington summit, we must go back to February 2025. Then too, Zelensky traveled to the White House, seeking security guarantees, arms supplies, and diplomatic cover. Instead, he was ambushed in a meeting that aides described as one of the most hostile ever between an American president and a wartime ally. Trump, with Vice President J.D. Vance at his side, accused Zelensky of dragging the United States towards World War III.
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you are not strong...
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the President for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Come once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military?
We have problems.
And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems, even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless. God bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because
I'm
you're in no
answering on
position
this
to
question.
dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly
this.
what
I'm not
You're in
dictating.
no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
Worse still, Trump torpedoed an energy deal that Ukraine had been negotiating to secure Western investment in its mineral resources. The episode left Zelensky politically weakened and deeply suspicious of Washington. For Ukraine's leader, the scars of that humiliation still linger. To arrive pleading for survival only to be dismissed and accused of recklessness by your supposed ally is a wound that does not fade quickly. That memory haunts this visit, shaping every calculation and every fear. And so as he returns now to Washington, D.C., he does so wary of a repeat performance, except this time with European leaders as witnesses. Yet, if Europe thinks its presence guarantees respect, history tells a different story. Washington has not always treated its allies as equals when it comes to Ukraine. In 2014, at the height of the Maidan protests, a leaked phone call between U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and then Ambassador Nuland-Pyatt exposed the raw truth. In that conversation, Nuland discussed who should and should not be in Ukraine's future government. But what seared itself into European memory was her offhand dismissal when she used expletives for the EU. The phrase revealed what many already suspected, that Washington was willing to bypass Europe, dictate outcomes, and keep control of Ukraine policy firmly in American hands. The leak was not just an embarrassment, it was a geopolitical revelation. It showed allies reduced to bystanders, their concerns waved away with profanity.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it.
Russia seized on the leak, portraying Ukraine's opposition leaders as puppets of the West. For Brussels, it was a reminder of just how disposable European input could be in Washington's calculus. And so, the question today is not abstract, it is painfully real. If Trump humiliated Zelensky once before, and if past US officials dismissed Europe so crudely, what guarantee is there that this summit will be any different? Layered onto this fragile history is the doctrine of spheres of influence. Vladimir Putin has long argued that Russia deserves a buffer zone, a cordon sanitaire that keeps NATO at bay. It is in essence a Russian version of the Monroe Doctrine, where the United States of America once told Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Putin now insists that the West stay out of Eastern Europe. For Moscow, this is not simply policy, it is destiny.
The outcome that this American president articulated, a ceasefire or consequences, he did not produce. And that is why I think we find ourselves in a difficult situation today. But Martha, this isn't over. There will be a meeting with Zelensky and European leaders, and then we'll see what happens after that. My hope is that President Trump will see, in hindsight, that President Putin is just trying to take us all for a ride, to keep this war going, keep attacking Ukraine without facing additional pressure. And we've got to cut him off at the pass.
And to the alarm of European leaders, Donald Trump appears to be listening. His rhetoric has hardened around a single point: Ukraine must never enter NATO. It is a formulation that echoes Moscow's red lines more than Kiev's aspirations. For the Europeans, the danger is clear. If Trump accepts a Russian Monroe Doctrine, he would, in effect, rewrite the post-Cold War settlement. Ukraine's sovereignty would be subordinated to Russia's security preferences, and Europe's hard-won principle that smaller nations have the right to choose their alliances would be shattered. This is why Zelensky's arrival in Washington has taken on such urgency. He's not merely lobbying for weapons or aid. He's fighting for agency, the right of his country to decide its own future. And by traveling with such a heavyweight delegation of European leaders, he is making a pointed statement: Ukraine will not negotiate alone. This is not a petition from a desperate nation. It is a coalition standing shoulder to shoulder, insisting that principles matter more than power. The Europeans too are fighting for credibility. Having spent decades preaching the sanctity of borders and sovereignty, they cannot afford to stand by while Trump and Putin carve up Ukraine in bilateral talks. For leaders like Macron, Merz, and Starmer, this summit is as much about Europe's dignity as it is about Ukraine's survival. To be seen as spectators now, after years of speeches about values and solidarity, would be politically and morally devastating.
I think ultimately, if this whole effort doesn't work out, then there's going to have to be additional consequences to Russia. But we're trying to avoid that by reaching a peace agreement. And that's not going to be easy. It's going to take a lot of work. I think there were things that were identified in those talks that we just had a couple days ago that made some progress in some directions. Now, obviously, in order for us to get a peace agreement, Ukraine has to be a part of it. They have to be included. They have to be involved. That's why the president called them on the phone immediately after we got on the airplane. Within an hour, he talked to them for long periods of time. That's why President Zelensky will be traveling to Washington tomorrow, along with several European leaders as well, to continue to work on this. We made progress in the sense that we identified potential areas of agreement, but there remain some big areas of disagreement. So we're still a long ways off. I mean, we're not at the precipice of a peace agreement. We're not at the edge of one, but I do think progress was made towards one. You can't have a peace agreement unless both sides give and get. You can't have a peace agreement unless both sides make concessions. That's a fact. That's true in virtually any negotiation. If not, it's just called surrender. And neither side is going to surrender. So both sides are going to have to make concessions. So of course concessions were asked. But what utility would there be of me going on a program and tell you we've wagged our finger at Putin and told him you must do this and you must do that? It's only going to make it harder and less likely that they're going to agree to these things. So these negotiations, as much as everyone would love it to be a live pay-per-view event, these discussions only work best when they are conducted privately in serious negotiations in which people who have to go back and respond to constituencies.
But Trump is a master of disruption. His style thrives on humiliation, on the power play of making allies squirm. Just as he blindsided Zelensky in February, he could attempt to divide the Europeans now. He could flatter one leader, insult another, dangle promises before some, and pit them against each other. Already whispers in Washington suggest that Trump sees Macron as too soft, Melanie is too transactional, and von der Leyen as irrelevant. Division is not a risk, it is a tactic. And beneath the theater lies strategy. Trump does not hide his disdain for the European Union. He views NATO as a burden, not a bond, and he has long entertained the idea that America's security commitments in Europe are negotiable. So when European leaders sit down with Trump, they do so knowing full well he has sabotaged allies before, and he could sabotage them again. The shadow of history looms. At Yalta in 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin divided Europe into spheres of influence, sealing the fate of Eastern Europe for half a century. For many Europeans, the fear is that Washington and Moscow could attempt to draw lines on a map yet again, this time at Ukraine's expense. Yalta's ghost hangs heavy in the air of Washington, a reminder that when great powers bargain, smaller nations can vanish into the margins. And Trump's Alaska summit with Putin only heightened those fears. There, the optics were unmistakable. Two great powers meeting without Europe or Ukraine in the room, discussing the future of a sovereign state as if it were a bargaining chip. Zelensky and his European allies now see this Washington meeting as a chance to stop history from repeating itself, to prevent a new Yalta moment, one that consigns Ukraine to Russia's fear. At the heart of this confrontation lies a fundamental question: whose security matters? For Trump, the answer may be America's alone. For Putin, it is Russia's. For Europe and Ukraine, the answer must include the rights of smaller states, nations whose sovereignty cannot simply be traded away in great power bargains. The Washington summit is therefore not a simple negotiation. It is a test of whether principles can still stand in the face of raw power.
The United States is potentially prepared to be able to give Article 5 security guarantees, but not from NATO, directly from the United States and other European countries. That is big. I mean, really big.
Does it mean boots on the ground? What does it mean, but logistically?
I think part of the discussion that we're going to have on Monday throughout the day, because there's going to be breakout sessions there, is exactly the specifics of what the Ukrainians feel that they need. Because remember, as mediators, we were at this summit to advance the Ukrainian position, and we did that, and we did it successfully. Now it's for us to drill down on the granular details of exactly what the Ukrainians need to give them a sense of security in the future, and by the way, what the Europeans need as well.
And yet, power often dictates outcomes more than principle, which is why the presence of European leaders in Washington is so crucial. They're not only standing beside Zelensky, they're standing for the idea that Europe will not be sidelined, as it was in that infamous 2014 phone call, or dismissed with contemptuous words. Their unity is fragile, but their symbolism is strong. The meeting in Washington therefore carries immense weight. If Trump pushes Putin's demands, if he repeats his February sabotage, Europe could find itself humiliated once more. But if Zelensky and his allies hold the line, if they can prevent Trump from imposing a Russian Monroe Doctrine, then perhaps this summit will mark a turning point, not just for Ukraine, but for the Transatlantic alliance itself. The next hours will tell whether unity triumphs or fractures. And so Washington becomes more than just another diplomatic stage. It becomes the mirror of a war that might never have been. Russia had drawn its red lines clearly: no NATO on its borders, no Ukraine inside the alliance, and yet Kiev under Volodymyr Zelensky pushed forward, making promises of NATO membership. If NATO was ready to deliver, it would have been a different matter altogether. But did Zelensky bite more than he could chew, and in that process lose significant parts of Ukrainian territory? For a country at war, the choice for Zelensky is between their constitution and permanent peace. Now, Donald Trump echoes what Moscow has said all along, that peace can only come by respecting those red lines. No NATO for Ukraine, and the biggest demand, Trump says Russia can keep Crimea, a huge strategic asset and the only warm water port of Russia that Kiev lost during Obama presidency. Inside Ukraine, voices are growing louder, questioning whether Zelensky's gamble was a tragic miscalculation, one that invited Russia's fury without securing NATO's protection. The stakes remain immense. Europe's borders, Ukraine's survival, and the very credibility of the West's security order. It seems like Putin has already won half the battle. So if Ukraine needs peace, it needs DC, and with DC siding with Putin, Russia has indeed almost won the war. Thank you for watching Statecraft.